South American neighbors face off over historical claims on oil-rich land. Guyana and Venezuela have long disputed their rights to the Essequibo region, a controversy now coming to a head. But can it be resolved via international arbitration, or will the onset of a military standoff escalate further? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmakers are Venezuela and Guyana. Now, in 1899, a so-called international agreement awarded the British colony of Guyana sovereignty over Venezuelan-claimed Essequibo. The problem, according to Caracas, was that there were no Venezuelans involved in that arbitration, allowing one of the biggest colonial powers of the time to take massive tracts of land from a much weaker, independent Venezuela. That formed the basis for what became a sort of frozen conflict over the mostly unpopulated land that forms almost two-thirds of Guyana today. So after many years of relative silence on the issue, Caracas now says it wants Essequibo back. And Venezuelans seem to support that, even if they're divided on how to get there. Here's a look now at how the dispute has led to military escalation over this resource-rich territory.
A show of force by Venezuela after the UK sent a warship to Guyana. Tensions between the two countries over the oil-rich Essequibo region have escalated again. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro says the presence of the warship is a provocation. In response, he's initiated military exercises and deployed more than 5,000 soldiers near the border. Venezuela's defense ministry says the soldiers will stay put until the British Navy ship leaves.
This breaks the spirit of dialogue, diplomacy, and peace of the Argyle agreements. I am saying it from Venezuela, and this is a threat from the United Kingdom against a noble, peaceful, but warrior people, the people of Venezuela.
But Guyanese officials say the arrival of the warship is routine, and its presence enhances the country's defenses.
Nothing that we do or we have done has threatened Venezuela. We don't plan on invading Venezuela. President Maduro knows this.
Venezuela has long sought control over the disputed Essequibo region. It says the land was stolen from Venezuela by means of international arbitration and awarded to colonial ruler Britain in 1899. Venezuela also says the border, drawn in arbitration, was annulled by the 1966 Geneva Agreement, which established a commission to solve the dispute. Despite the ongoing case in the International Court of Justice and its order to refrain from action, Maduro held a referendum on the takeover of the region in early December. Venezuelans overwhelmingly backed the government's claim of sovereignty.
A sign that we are convinced that this Essequibo is ours, because it is ours. It has always been this way. It doesn't have to be any other way now.
The dispute intensified after the U.S. company ExxonMobil discovered large oil reserves in Guyana in 2015. The small nation could soon be one of the world's top oil producers, with the potential to generate huge wealth for its population. And while Guyana's economy is thriving, Venezuela is suffering under economic sanctions. Analysts say Maduro is seeking to garner support ahead of upcoming elections. He also announced a series of measures to solidify the result of the vote. He established a military unit for the region and presented a new official state map, which includes Essequibo, paving the way for oil exploration.
We will proceed to give operating licenses for the exploration of oil, gas, and mines in all our Guyana Essequibo.
In response, Guyana's President Irfan Ali said the country is taking every step to protect itself, including reaching out to allies and partners in the region.
Guyana views this as an imminent threat to its territorial integrity and will intensify precautionary measures to safeguard its territory. The Guyana Defense Force is on full alert and has engaged its military counterparts, including the U.S. Southern Command.
The U.S. and Guyana have held joint military drills, and Brazil reinforced its military presence at the border while urging Venezuela to exercise restraint. Last month, Maduro and Ali met in the Caribbean island nation of St. Vincent and agreed not to make threats or use force against each other, a step forward for de-escalation. But recent developments show the situation remains highly volatile. and the danger of a potential military conflict remains.
So, with further military escalation on the cards and international arbitration still in question, how can the Essequibo dispute be resolved? Joining me now to debate that and more are from Washington, Guyana's former ambassador to the U.S., Riyad Insanally. From New York, lawyer and former Venezuelan ambassador to Luxembourg, Angelina Jaffe. And from Atlanta, former chief of staff of Guyana's Defense Forces, retired Rear Admiral Gary Best. Now, we also reached out to the Venezuelan government for their participation in this debate, but unfortunately received no response. Let's start then with the latest military escalations here. Both Venezuela and Guyana say that they are taking defensive measures. Guyana in response to what it says are threats from Venezuela, and then Venezuela in response to that British warship sent, plus these joint U.S. military drills. So, Gary, I'll start with you. Everyone says there should be a peaceful resolution, but given the steps taken and the rhetoric we've heard, where do you see this going?
Well, thanks very much for having me on the program. Let me start by saying that the 1899 arbitral award for us in Guyana is a full, final, and perfect settlement of the border between Guyana and Venezuela, then British Guyana and Venezuela. As to your instant question, Guyana is not being bellicose in any way. Guyana does not present any threat to Venezuela militarily. If you look at the two nations' armed forces, you can see it's almost a mismatch. So Guyana is not up the ante in any way. I believe the issue that became present and prescient in this instance is the referendum in Venezuela and the steps taken subsequently to annex Essequibo. I think that is what raised the ante, and the Argyle Declaration was meant to bring a sort of calm and peace to the region. So Guyana in no way can really threaten Venezuela militarily. As to the British warship that's in the region, as explained before, this was planned before. Guyana's had many military drills through bilateral cooperation with the United States, with France, Brazil, and many other countries. There's no way we're a threat to Venezuela. I think the most important thing really is to allow the ICJ to settle the issue of the validity of the 1899 arbitral award, and I think we can move on from there.
Okay, well, let me check in with Angelina on that, because Angelina, you have looked in detail at the historical merits of this case, which many Venezuelans think are very valid. Guyana may have no sympathy, but why should Venezuela have a case here, despite whatever the government in power is saying, rhetoric or no rhetoric? Why does Venezuela have a strong case?
Well, the case for Venezuela is a historical grievance. This is rooted in the 19th century when Guyana was a British colony, and there was an arbitration in Den Haag, which was rigged and was not a fair procedure. And Venezuela has lived with this grievance all its independent lifetime. That said, historical grievances are all around the world, and it should not be an argument for contemporary cases. But Venezuela do have the need to secure its rights in the sea and the maritime protection of the landmass. And that is, for me, the most important thing. It's impossible to think that Guyana has to make landmass concessions. And I agree with the Admiral that we should solve this matter before the International Court of Justice, and not with saber rattles. And I don't believe that this will go into an armed conflict. The Maduro regime makes a lot of noise, but in the end, it will do nothing really to offend.
To further escalate. Let me
to
ask you though,
further escalate.
Angelina, I mean, you say that there's a need for Venezuela then to at least secure its rights in the sea, but that's what many people are confused on because they seem to go hand in hand. If Venezuela does not have land rights over Essequibo, it also doesn't have the maritime rights to the
Yes, it
surrounding.
has. It
You
has.
believe it does?
Of course it has, because the delta of the Orinoco has its projection to the Atlantic Sea, the ocean, and Venezuela has rights in the sea. It has delimited the frontier with Trinidad and Tobago.
So okay,
and
so
that should,
why isn't that good enough then for Venezuela? I mean, because that's, correct me again if I'm wrong, that's where a lot of the offshore oil can actually be claimed as well
yes,
that Venezuela is interested in. So why not just leave it at that? Why not try to fight for the maritime rights that you think are they're legally entitled to? Why go for this?
Because politicians take these matters into their interest. And as it has been said many years ago, patriotism is the last resource of a scoundrel. And Maduro is playing the patriotism card to secure his stay in power.
Okay, interesting. Well, let me turn to Riyadh because it's not just about what the government says. I mean, there is a view in Venezuela among many who do not even support Nicolas Maduro, but agree that the British Empire, in a sense, took advantage of a newly independent and, much weaker Venezuela to carry out a land grab, which was eventually passed on to Guyana, even though there were Geneva agreements that were supposed to block Guyana from exploiting the territory for oil exploration and otherwise. Does Guyana, let me ask you, I'll put it this way, does Guyana have any sympathy for the historic claims of a country that feels it was the victim of an exploitative colonial power?
First of all, let me disabuse you of the notion that the Geneva Agreement was meant to prevent Guyana from exploiting any of its resources in its sovereign territory. The Geneva Agreement was meant to find a peaceful means to resolve the controversy arising from Venezuela's contention that the 1899 arbitral award was null and void. Now, the British may well have had aspirations in the 19th century to acquiring land up to the Orinoco Delta, but there's no history of Venezuelan or Spanish occupation of the Essequibo region of Guyana. Venezuela itself was looking at acquiring land all the way up to the Essequibo River in Guyana, and it wasn't a newly independent Venezuela. In relative terms, Venezuela was a much older country than Guyana is now. I think when you get to the late 1890s and U.S. intervention to ensure that the British were kept at bay in the Americas, the call for arbitration by the U.S., the pressure from the U.S. To get the United Kingdom to enter into arbitration, international arbitration, with some of the most distinguished jurists of the day involved, was meant to settle the matter once and for all. And the 1899 award did that, so much so that Venezuela accepted the award. I think it was in 1905 that the borders were confirmed by an act of Congress in Venezuela. And they lived with that until 1962, when Cold War tensions prompted a renewal of Venezuela's claim based on a posthumous memorandum by a junior counsel on the Venezuelan team, which surfaced alleging collusion. And this is what Dr. Jaffe was referring to. But there's no evidence to support that. No one was alive at the time, and even Severo Maleprevot himself, who had written the memorandum, was dead.
Interesting.
So we have a situation whereby a larger country is threatening a smaller country. It's an asymmetrical relationship. It's a David and Goliath issue. And Guyana has no option but to look to the international court for a peaceful and legally binding settlement.
Okay, so
if I might add, regarding what Dr. Jaffe said about the Atlantic and the projection of the Orinoco Delta, in international law, the land dominates the sea. The land border, therefore, is the key point to determine where the maritime border is drawn. We have to settle this issue of the land border before we can even start discussing the maritime line that divides Venezuela's waters from Guyana's waters.
Angelina, go ahead, because you don't believe that is the case.
Well, then you agree that there is a land border problem? Are you saying that? Because
We
I'm
don't have a
denying it,
problem.
but
We don't have a problem, but and I'm delighted to hear a reasonable voice coming from Venezuela, and yours is a reasonable voice. The matter should be settled by the International Court of Justice.
If I may,
well, some precisions. The arbitration case in the 19th century was recognized worldwide as an unfair arbitration settlement because Venezuela was not represented at the arbitration case. The United States had to take the representation of Venezuela because the British didn't want to sit down with Venezuelan delegates, and it was not motivated. The ruling was not motivated. So it influenced the Den Haag treaty about arbitration in the sense that it established the obligation of self-representation and the obligation of motivation. So you cannot say that there is no proof that this was an unfair case. It was an unfair case. And it would be very good for both countries if this unfairness could be acknowledged in order to establish a fair sea delimitation in the area. And I do agree that this case must be solved before the International Court of Justice.
And Angelina, do you think the court would be fair? Because it doesn't seem that Venezuelan authorities trust the ICJ to make a fair ruling on this.
Of course they don't trust it because they misrepresented Venezuela's case at the court. The Maduro government does not lead a fair and intelligent defense of the interest of Venezuela in that space. And they know they're going to lose in the border sense that the territorial claim will not be satisfied in the way that they are selling it.
So, but from your perspective, though, they should be going after the maritime rights that, from your legal analysis, says they are legally entitled to have, even though Guyana disagrees. And that is the case the ICJ could, you believe, fairly decide on.
Well, the ICJ will not decide about the limitation.
The maritime court, sorry, the International Maritime Court. No, not even.
No. Not even that. We are not there yet. The International Court of Justice will decide whatever the Geneva Accords are in place or not.
Okay.
That's what the court will decide, and then we have to proceed to further the limitation of, well, in my opinion, maritime spaces. If I would be Venezuela's government, I would have asked the International Court of Justice for preliminary objections for Guyana to give oil concessions in that area. But the government of Maduro has not done that. So
there's a lot to understand on legally here. So much for the courts to really unpack. But if it's narrowed down to what you're saying, Angelina, to a specific style of argument that you think would probably not hold up in an international court, then Venezuela might have problems going forward, even if it is legally entitled to what you say as far as maritime jurisdiction is concerned.
Venezuela will have problems, and it's even worse because Venezuela hired a completely low-ranking lawyer, and Guyana has the best one. Philip Sands is the best international lawyer.
Okay.
Current.
Interesting. Gary, I know you think it's not about having a better lawyer. You genuinely think it is just strictly the merits of the case, the historical claims that are Guyana's, including the legal territory trying to move it forward. But I want to ask you, Gary, because when it comes to defense of Guyana, you know, this isn't just international. It's also a regional issue. And you have neighbors like Brazil who are starting to mobilize troops as well. And they say they're going to do all they can to stop this from escalating any further. So is Guyana looking toward governments like Brazil's to help kind of bring down the rhetoric and stop this from escalating further? Or is this really only between Venezuela and Guyana?
No,
you
it's
are
not
asking
only
me?
between Venezuela.
Gary, go ahead.
No, no, it's not only between Venezuela and Guyana. It's a regional issue, both within the CARICOM region and within the Latin American region. Guyana has consistently over the years depended on Brazil and other Latin American countries to see the merits of its own case. So Brazil historically has done what it is now doing, conducting blocking operations to prevent any real threat to the border between Guyana and Venezuela, because there is a trijunction point where Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil meet. But let me just add to what Ambassador Insanally said earlier when you posed the question to him. The 1899 arbitral award was unanimous. It's full, final, and perfect. President Crespo of Venezuela at that time, he selected the arbitrators for Venezuela. Secondly, the Venezuelans relied on American lawyers. Mali Provost, the gentleman who left the posthumous letter, was an American lawyer, even though his mother was Mexican. So
their argument was, though, that Venezuela was not
argue,
given a choice but to appoint Americans to represent them,
yes,
non-Venezuelans to represent them.
That is the argument. But again, Venezuela was a nation state, an independent nation state, as you were saying, many, many decades before. So it's really a difficult argument when they had an opportunity to choose their own lawyers and to choose their own arbitrators, even though the rhetoric from Venezuela is that it didn't. Secondly, the Geneva Agreement in its fullness provided for the matter to go before the ICJ as a possibility if the contention by Venezuela to the validity of the 1899 arbitral award was not dealt with within the Geneva Agreement. That could not have been done. But here we are now before the ICJ, and at the same time having issues of bellicose language, which hopefully the Argyle Agreement would have reduced. So I believe within the CARICOM context also, there's the RSS, the Regional Security System. We have within South America itself, we have good relations with other South American countries, including Brazil. So I believe regionally there is room for dialogue and de-escalation of the issues. My final point of this issue is that Guyana has already delimited its maritime boundaries within its 83,000 square miles. Those boundaries have been delimited using international maritime law, using the equidistant theory. So we've delimited those boundaries. So if you look at the map of Guyana and the fact that the boundary has been settled, then we can see the maritime boundaries itself remaining as they are. And to Dr. Jaffe's point about Venezuela having a maritime leeway, so to speak, or a maritime space, becomes one that is complex. It will provide a lot of complexity if you look at it carefully, because the maritime boundary, boundaries have been settled between Suriname and Guyana and Venezuela.
Okay.
I understand the by Venezuela, and that is why I believe that the Venezuelans are still pressing the land issue, because they recognize under international law that the maritime boundary springs from the land boundary.
Okay. Final question then. We're down to our last minute and a half. Riyad, I'll come back to you quickly, because it seems Venezuela won't respect, with this current government in power, will not respect any ruling by the ICJ. So is this frozen conflict status sustainable? Is it possible that for the time being, kind of no one will be allowed to touch the area while it is still in dispute? Or will it come down to one country or the other forcefully trying to administer their rights, exploit the resources there, and conflict ensuing?
Let me be clear, Guyana disputes nothing. The area that Venezuela claims is Guyana's, and Guyana has every right to pursue exploration and exploitation of its resources as it sees fit, and that's what it's doing. The international companies that are operating in Guyana are doing so in accordance with Guyanese law and with international law. The fact that oil has been used as an explanation for the escalation by Venezuela, by Maduro, of the controversy is perhaps valid, but one has to remember that all the offshore oil exploration and production taking place is off the coast of Guyana, the counties of Demerara and Berbice. The Stabroek Block reaches all along the coast of Guyana up to the border with Venezuela, but the current activities our offshore.
Angelina, yeah, if it doesn't work out in favor of Venezuela on those legal grounds that you see are fit, what happens?
Okay, well, I guess it won't, the ruling will not be in favor of Venezuela. And I don't think there is going to happen pretty much because armed conflict in that area is senseless. It has no meaning. How can you conduct military actions in the rainforest? It's quite unfeasible, I would say.
Angelina, we have to hope you're right and that peace does prevail in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, we'll have to follow these legal actions very closely and see what happens. I'm sure we'll be revisiting the subject soon. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.